I stood in front of the entrance to the exclusive pool, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin and holding Jason's hand. He was joyfully hopping up and down, anticipating the chance to swim in the water. Today was a hot day, and I knew he had been waiting for this moment for so long. The place looked immaculate. Well-kept flower beds, white plastic loungers, bright umbrellas. It seemed to say, "This place is only for the chosen ones?" But as soon as we approached, a security guard appeared before us. He was tall, with a strong build, and his face remained indifferent. There was something in his gaze that made me tense up. "Membership is only for whites," he said dryly, blocking our way. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. Jason, standing beside me, didn't understand what was happening, but I could already see his eyes starting to fill with tears. I wanted to scream, but I forced myself to hold it together. Looking around at the other visitors, I noticed that no one even glanced our way, as if they were used to such scenes or simply preferred not to get involved. I picked Jason up and tried to comfort him, whispering in his ear that everything would be okay. But inside, I was seething with rage. This humiliation was unforgivable. I decided I wouldn't just let this go. Deep down, I knew that if I walked away now, I would lose. And it wouldn't just be me. My son and everyone else who this world still considered unworthy would lose too. I took a deep breath and headed toward the reception desk, gripping Jason's hand tighter. A man in a suit stood before me, well-groomed and self-assured. He didn't even look up when I approached. "My son wants to swim," I said coldly, "and he will swim, or I will start a war." He slowly raised his eyes and sneered with disdain. That smile told me everything. He wasn't afraid. He was confident in his power and that I wouldn't be able to do anything to him, but this arrogance would be his downfall. I turned and left, holding Jason's hand. He was crying, but I knew it wouldn't be for long. A plan was already forming in my mind, and I knew this pool would soon be empty. I came home, lost in thought. My anger had turned into resolve. This injustice couldn't go unpunished. The idea came to me suddenly, like a revelation. If they didn't want to let us into the pool, I would make sure no one would want to go there. I remembered working as a nurse in the hospital. I always had access to various drugs and chemicals that could cause all sorts of reactions in people. All I needed to do was get into that pool and add something to the water. The next day, I prepared carefully. I took a small bag and filled it with vials of different substances. I chose ones that caused skin irritation, mild allergies, and minor infections. Nothing serious, but enough to cause panic. I smiled at my reflection in the mirror, getting ready for my role. I was ready. Under the cover of night, I snuck onto the pool grounds. It was quiet, with only the sound of water and the distant noise of the city. I approached the edge of the pool, looking around to make sure no one noticed me. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had to do this. I began pouring the contents of the vials into the water, one by one, watching as the liquid slowly dissolved. It felt like a magical ritual. Once finished, I quietly left, feeling a growing sense of satisfaction inside me. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next day, I returned to the pool. I knew they hadn't remembered my face, and what reason did I have to hide? I stood to the side, watching the events unfold, like an audience member at a play. People started filling the pool, laughing and enjoying the summer day. At first, everything went as usual, but soon I noticed a woman nervously scratching. Then a man, who had just gotten out of the water, found a rash on his hands. Panic began. Screams, people running around, jumping out of the pool as if scalded. I stood aside, trying not to show my glee. No one understood what was happening. The manager was running back and forth, trying to calm the guests, but it was too late. They were calling ambulances, calling their doctors, but no one could figure out what kind of infection had hit them. A week later, the pool was closed. They said they needed to carry out sanitation, find the cause of the outbreak. I saw it on TV and couldn't contain my laughter. I felt like the director of an absurd film. Club members are falling victim to infections, allergies, and skin rashes. the local news reported. It was my little victory, and no one could stop me. I didn't care about the consequences. I relished the chaos I had created. And now, seeing the terrified faces of those who had looked at me with disdain yesterday, I felt only one thing: satisfaction. They got what they deserved, and my son would no longer cry. He would see that his mother could do anything for justice, even if that justice was far from moral. When I put on my white coat and walked into the hospital ward, a smile played on my lips. I had always thought of white as a symbol of purity and innocence, but at that moment I knew it was just a mask. It was ironic how things had turned out. Those who had looked down on me not so long ago now lay helpless and frightened. They were used to thinking of themselves as the chosen ones, the rightful masters of life. And now here I was, standing over them, knowing that my power over them was absolute. There were 6 beds in the ward, each occupied by my old acquaintances from the elite club. I recognized them all. Mrs. Andrews, always adorned with expensive jewelry and a haughty gaze. Mr. Larson, impeccably dressed even in his hospital pajamas. And of course Jim, the one who always put me in my place with his sharp remarks. Now they were here, exhausted, their skin covered in rashes, their eyes full of fear. Their once proud faces looked pathetic, and just the sight of it filled my heart with a dark satisfaction. The irony was that they had no idea that their illnesses were the result of my handiwork. When I added various chemicals to the pool water, I hadn't anticipated seeing them again, and certainly not in this state. Fate had played into my hands, and I was enjoying this show. "How are you today, Mrs. Andrews?" I asked, approaching the woman's bed. Her face was flushed, her breathing was labored, and her skin showed signs of irritation. "Not well," she groaned, looking at me with despair. "Will you help me, nurse?" I nodded, hiding my smile. Of course, I would help, but my help would be different from what she was asking for. Every day when I entered the ward, I was overwhelmed by a sense of power. All these people with their illnesses, with their fears, were under my control. They called me their angel, believed I was the only one who could save them, and I delighted in watching them cling to my every word, my every action, thinking I would save them. I was their best friend, their only hope. "Jim, how are you feeling?" I asked one of the patients, who seemed to be suffering more than the others. He was pale, his face covered in sweat, his eyes full of despair. "Nurse, I think it's getting worse," he said, breathing heavily. "These pills you're giving me, are they helping?" I looked at him, trying to hide my inner smile. Of course, they weren't helping. On the contrary, I was doing everything I could to worsen his condition. But he didn't know that, so I had nothing to worry about. "Of course, Jim," I replied, patting his hand. "You just need to be patient. The medicine will start working." He nodded, too weak to argue. A thought flashed through my mind: how easy it is to manipulate people when they are so helpless. I knew they were all afraid of death, and that fear made them obedient, like children. But one day, Jim began to suspect something was wrong. He waited until the other patients had fallen asleep and quietly called me over to his bed. "Nurse, I know something's not right," he whispered, looking around. "My wife has filed a complaint. She thinks we're not being treated properly here. I heard that inspectors have come." My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly pulled myself together. I smiled at Jim and leaned closer. "Don't worry, Jim," I said, gently squeezing his hand. "I'm here to help you. Everything will be fine." But inside, I knew I had to be careful. If the hospital really was going to be inspected, I needed to act quickly. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jim's words kept troubling me. I knew that if his wife's complaints led to inspections, everything could fall apart. My games with the patients could be exposed, and then there would be no avoiding the consequences. But there was something else, something that irritated me. How dare he suspect me? I had done everything to appear caring and kind. That meant Jim no longer trusted me, and for that, he would have to pay. I went to the medicine cabinet and found the bottles of pills I had been using for Jim. Today, I decided to make one small but crucial adjustment. The pills that were supposed to help his heart were replaced with those that could cause a heart attack. I knew that if I did everything right, no one would suspect that I had anything to do with his death. It would look like a natural outcome of the illness. I went over to his bed and woke him with a gentle touch. "Jim, take these pills," I said, looking at him with feigned concern. "They will help you." He took the pills, not suspecting that they would be his last. I watched as he swallowed them with water, feeling a cold satisfaction growing inside me. A few hours later, Jim began to struggle to breathe. His face turned red, his hands clutched at the blanket. He tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. I stood by, watching his agony, and thought, how easy it is to erase a life. One wrong step, and a person is gone forever. When it was all over, I carefully disposed of the pill bottles, erasing my tracks. No one suspected anything. In the morning, the doctors pronounced it a heart attack. I stood by his bed, looking at his pale face, and thought how absurd it all seemed. These people believed I would save them, yet I was destroying them from within. They called me an angel in white, not realizing that I was their worst nightmare. Rumors spread through the city like the infection I had created myself. People whispered about strange illnesses, sudden deaths, and at the center of it all was that same exclusive club. I saw on the news how one hospital after another was closing, trying to prevent the spread of the diseases. The city was in panic, and that's when I heard about the arrival of the lawyer. His name was Michael Harrington, and he was known for his persistence and his ability to get to the truth. Harrington wasn't someone who could be easily fooled or scared. He was famous for his high-profile cases, exposés, and scandals. His arrival was accompanied by a buzz in the press, like a storm cloud hanging over the city. I knew that if he took on this case, he would uncover everything. I saw him on television promising to find the culprits, saying that no one could escape justice. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. I had to act, and fast. My actions had become too noticeable. I couldn't let some lawyer destroy everything I had built. I had worked too long to get to this moment. A plan was already forming in my mind. Harrington had to be dealt with before he found any evidence. But it had to be done in a way that no one could connect his death to me. No one should suspect that it was anything but an unfortunate accident. I was used to operating discreetly and invisibly, and this time was no exception. I decided to pose as a journalist. I prepared myself, picked out a suitable outfit, styled my hair. In my hand was a notebook, on my face, a smile. I didn't expect everything to go smoothly, but I was sure. All I needed was a chance. Our eyes met in the hotel lobby, and I immediately knew that Harrington didn't suspect anything. He looked tired, but determined. His suit fit him perfectly, and he had the practiced smile of someone used to dealing with the press. "Mr. Harrington, may I ask you a few questions?" I asked, approaching him. "I'm a journalist, writing an article about your investigation." He looked at me with interest, but didn't seem to suspect anything. "Of course," he replied, nodding. "I'm just heading to the restaurant. We can talk over lunch." I smiled, pretending it was a great idea. Gladly. The restaurant was quiet, cozy, with dim lighting and tables covered with tablecloths. We sat in the corner, away from prying eyes. I ordered wine. Harrington clearly liked expensive wines, and I tried to pick one he would enjoy. It was red, rich, and I had already laced it with poison. My hand didn't tremble as I poured his glass. He talked, and I listened, nodding at the right moments, pretending I was really interested in what he was saying. "You know," he said, taking a sip, "I think this case is far more complex than it seems at first glance. I'm almost certain that powerful people are involved, but I'll find them, even if I have to turn the whole city upside down." I smiled, hiding my malice behind the smile. He had no idea that the end was near. "You're a very brave man, Mr. Harrington," I said, pouring him more wine. "I think you will succeed." He drank more, not realizing that every sip brought him closer to death. I watched as his face slowly paled, as his breathing became labored. He clutched his chest, his eyes widening in horror. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. "What? What did you do?" he rasped, collapsing to the floor. "Nothing special," I replied, standing up. "Just gave fate a little help." I calmly left the restaurant, leaving Harrington on the floor. No one noticed as I left. Outside, I saw my son. He was waiting for me in the car. His face was glowing with joy, so happy to see me. I smiled at him, feeling a growing satisfaction inside. Everything was going according to plan. The news of Harrington's death spread through the city like wildfire. Everyone knew he was investigating the pool case, and his sudden death only added fuel to the fire. People began to whisper, fearing that something terrible was happening. Newspapers were full of headlines, and the news treated the lawyer's death as the biggest tragedy. Everyone wanted to know what happened, and everyone was trying to find an answer. I watched it all, like an audience member at a play. My role in this drama was hidden, and I enjoyed watching everyone worry, not knowing what was really going on. People feared for their lives, their health, but no one could understand that the real danger had been close to them all along. I heard someone say that Harrington had heart problems. Someone else suggested that he drank something wrong. I couldn't help but laugh. Heart problems? Or maybe he just chose the wrong wine, I said to myself, laughing at the absurdity of the situation. They were trying to find meaning in something that was meaningless. I knew their panic was just the beginning, and I wanted to see how they would run around in search of the truth they would never find. I saw the police, doctors, and reporters bustling around, trying to figure out what had happened. All these people, with their claims to knowledge and power, didn't realize they were playing by my rules. I had created chaos, and now I was enjoying its fruits. No one suspected me. No one knew that I was behind all these deaths and illnesses. When I returned home, my son greeted me. He ran to me, hugging me tightly. I felt his warmth seep into me, his joy at seeing me warming my heart. "Mom, you were gone for a long time," he said, looking up at me with his big, trusting eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I replied, kissing his forehead. "I had things to do." I knew that I would do anything for him. I wouldn't let anyone destroy our world, and if that meant destroying others, I would do it without hesitation. The screams woke me. They pierced the silence of the night, making my heart beat faster. I sat up in bed, trying to figure out what was happening. A siren wailed outside, and I heard more screams. Something was burning. I got up and went to the window, looking out. Flames were engulfing the neighboring house, and all I could see were tongues of fire consuming everything in their path. I quickly recognized the house. It belonged to the same security guard who had refused to let Jason and me into the pool, the one who had treated us with disdain, like second-class citizens. I watched as his house turned to ashes, and a strange feeling of satisfaction spread through me. It felt like a sign, like a manifestation of justice, whether from above or from the depths of my own mind. Fate was a funny thing, but the strange feeling of joy quickly turned into something else, a sense of opportunity. This was a chance, and I couldn't let it slip away. I knew what I had to do. I threw on a robe and went outside. The cold night air chilled me to the bone, but the fire ahead warmed me. The screams were getting louder, and I headed towards the security guard's house, trying to show concern on my face. This house would be the setting for my next move, and I wasn't going to miss the opportunity. When I approached the burning house, chaos unfolded before me. People were running back and forth, trying to save their belongings, shouting, calling for help. The security guard was in the thick of it all, his eyes wide with terror. He was shouting, his voice frantic, calling for the firefighters, who were still nowhere to be seen. "Damn it! Somebody help!" he screamed, rushing toward the house and then backing away from the heat. I came closer, pretending I genuinely wanted to help. "What happened?" I asked, trying to hide a smile. "Do you need help?" He turned to me, his face pale with fear. "Yes, my wife, my son, they're inside." He was almost screaming, his voice trembling. "They can't get out." I nodded, pretending to be scared and sympathetic. "I'll try to help," I said, and ran toward the house with him. But in reality, I knew I wasn't going to save anyone. Inside me, a cold calculation reigned. I wanted to see this man suffer, to see his world crumble, to watch him lose everything he held dear. We entered the house, into the flames, and I watched him frantically searching, shouting the names of his wife and son. I pretended to look, to try to help, but in reality, I was only getting in the way. "They're here! They must be here!" he shouted, running from one room to another. I stayed in the doorways, blocking his way, pretending to help. I knew that if he could find them, he could save them, but I couldn't let that happen. I watched as the fire consumed everything around us, as smoke filled the rooms, and I felt only one thing, a strange, twisted satisfaction. By the time the firefighters arrived, it was too late. All they could do was douse the remnants of the house with water. The guard's wife and son were dead. I watched him as he realized this, and I saw his face twist with horror. His world was falling apart right before my eyes, and I couldn't look away. The next day, I found out that the security guard had killed himself. He couldn't live with the loss, and it was entirely predictable. People like him, who were used to controlling everything around them, couldn't cope when they lost that control. I stood by his grave, listening to the weeping of his relatives, feeling a strange calm. One night had changed everything. His life, once full of confidence and power, had collapsed like a house of cards. I watched as they lowered him into the ground, thinking about how easily a life could be broken. My life, on the other hand, was just beginning. I knew these events would leave a mark, but that mark would not be mine. No one could connect the fire to my identity, to my actions. It was just a chain of coincidences that led to tragedy. Or maybe it was fate. But what difference did it make? I left the cemetery, the wind kicking up dust and carrying it into the air like his soul, if he even had one. I felt no pity, no compassion, only a quiet joy that everything had turned out as it should. "Justice is fire too," I whispered to myself, knowing that there were many more nights ahead, full of fire and ashes. The morning started as usual. I was drinking coffee, browsing the news, and enjoying the quiet. Jason was playing in his room, his laughter reaching me, creating the illusion of a normal life. Everything was going as it should, and I was content. But when I heard a knock on the door, something inside me tensed up. I walked to the door, looking through the peephole, and saw 2 police officers. They were standing at the doorstep, their faces serious, and behind them was a patrol car with its lights flashing. "Good morning," I said, opening the door, trying to remain calm. "How can I help you?" "Good morning, ma'am," one of the officers began. "We need to speak with you. Could you come down to the station with us to give a statement?" I felt my heart beat faster, but outwardly I remained composed. I knew this would happen sooner or later. Everything had become too noticeable, too many deaths and illnesses. But I was ready. I was always ready. "Of course," I said, nodding. "Give me a minute to gather my things." As I got into the car, I knew I had to be careful. They couldn't connect me to these deaths. I had done everything carefully, left no traces. But police officers, they're like dogs. They can sense danger, even if they can't see it. I smiled at them as we drove, and they smiled back. They didn't even suspect that this was all just a game. At the police station, I was met by a detective. His face was stern, and his eyes studied me with clear distrust. He pointed to a chair opposite his desk. "Sit down," he said curtly, and I did as he said. "Your name?" he began, preparing to take notes. "Elizabeth Taylor," I replied calmly, watching his reaction. He nodded, writing it down. "Elizabeth, you work as a nurse at St. Mark's Hospital?" "Yes," I confirmed, knowing he already knew the answer. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about the patients you treated," he started, pretending to look at his notes. "Specifically about Jim Hartman. He died a few weeks ago. We know he was your patient." I felt a slight chill down my spine at the mention of Jim's name, but I kept my expression neutral. "Yes, I remember Jim," I said softly. "It was a great loss for all of us." You were with him in his final days, the detective continued. What can you tell us about his condition? He was very weak, I replied, pretending to recall. A weak heart, breathing problems. I did everything I could to help him. The detective nodded, continuing to take notes. Are you aware that his wife filed a complaint against the hospital? She believes his death was caused by improper treatment. I made a surprised face, trying to show genuine sympathy. It's terrible, I said, shaking my head, but I'm sure we did everything possible. The detective squinted, his eyes narrowing. Elizabeth, he said, leaning closer, are you sure there's nothing you want to add? We have reason to believe that you're hiding something. I met his gaze, smiling. Detective, I understand your concern, but I always act in the best interests of my patients. I have no reason to hide anything. I could see his irritation growing. He was trying to catch me, to make me slip up, but he had no chance. I had left no evidence, and he knew it. As I was leaving the police station, the detective tried to stop me again. Elizabeth, wait, he said, getting up from his chair. I know you're hiding something. We'll find out what's going on. I turned to him, smiling. You have no idea how powerless you are, I said, looking him straight in the eye. He stood there, stunned, trying to understand what I meant, but I was already walking out the door. The sun was shining outside, and I felt the cold sweat on my back evaporating. I knew this meeting was just the beginning. They would try to find me, to expose me, but they wouldn't succeed. It was funny how they thought they could catch me. Police officers, so naive. They believed in their laws, in their rules, but I saw them only as obstacles to be bypassed. They didn't even suspect that I could control their lives as easily as I controlled my own. I headed home knowing this game was just beginning, and I was ready to play until I won. All I needed was to keep control of the situation, and I would. I returned to my world, knowing that as long as I kept everything under control, I had nothing to fear. It was one of those evenings when the silence of the house soothed me. Jason had been asleep for a long time, and I sat in the kitchen, finishing a glass of wine and enjoying my solitude. But when the doorbell rang, all the peace disappeared. I walked over to the door, listening intently. Who could be coming to see me at this hour? A man in an expensive suit stood on the doorstep, his face grim. I recognized him immediately. He was one of those who used to frequent the exclusive club, one of those who had once denied my son and me entry. I couldn't remember his name, but I knew his face. Good evening, he said, looking at me with suspicion. We need to talk. I opened the door wider, inviting him in. Of course, come in, I said, smiling. What brings you here? He stepped inside, his movements tense, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected an attack. We sat in the living room. I offered him a drink, but he refused. My name is Peter, he began, and I nodded, pretending to listen. I was a member of that club, the very club where all this started. I understand, I replied softly. And what do you want to know? His eyes gleamed, and I realized he felt more confident. He thought he had found the truth, that he could prove something, but I knew it was all just a game. Peter invited me to dinner, and I agreed. I was curious to know what he thought, what he knew. We met in a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town. Peter chose a secluded table, away from prying eyes. He ordered us wine, though he didn't look relaxed. There was fear mixed with determination in his eyes. Elizabeth, he began as soon as the waiter had left, I know you're hiding something. Since people started dying, I've been trying to understand what's happening, and all the threads lead to you. I smiled, pretending his words amused me. What are you trying to say, Peter? I asked, raising my glass. I'm just a nurse. I help people. I do what I can. Don't lie to me, he snapped. I know you're somehow connected to these deaths. Maybe you added something to the pool water, or did something with the medications at the hospital. I noticed his hand trembling as he brought the glass to his lips. He was scared, and I could see it. He wanted to know the truth, but was afraid of the consequences. Peter, I said softly, leaning in closer, you don't want to harm yourself or your family, do you? He looked at me, and I saw his confidence fade. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Let's do this," I continued, not breaking eye contact. "You forget everything you know, and you don't ask any more questions. And I, in turn, won't harm you or your family. Isn't that fair?" He hesitated, staring at me, and I could see his mind struggling. He knew I was dangerous, that I wasn't just a nurse, but he had no choice. "All right," he said finally. "I agree, but if I find out you've done something else—" "You won't," I interrupted him, smiling. "I assure you." A week passed. I kept an eye on Peter, watched his house, watched his family. He thought it was over, that he was safe. But I knew I couldn't leave him alive. He knew too much. So I decided to arrange his death to look like an accident. I found out he had an old staircase at home that led to the attic. It was rickety, and I knew it could easily be rigged to collapse. One rainy evening when Peter was home alone, I sneaked in. My hands trembled, but I knew I had to do it. I loosened the stairs' supports and quietly left. A few hours later, I heard on the news that Peter was dead. They found him at the bottom of the stairs. He had fallen and hit his head. Everyone thought it was an accident. No one knew that I was behind his death. I looked at his photo in the newspaper and couldn't help but smile. Life is a game, and the winner is the one who is willing to go all the way. And I enjoyed playing. It's funny how people think they can control their destiny when, in reality, I'm the one making the decisions. Peter thought he had found the truth, that he could stop me. But I'm always one step ahead. I control life and death, and nothing can stop me. I stepped outside, inhaling the fresh air, feeling free. This game isn't over yet, and I'm ready to keep playing. I always knew that sooner or later, I would reach the top. This whole game was just a matter of time, and I knew that the key to victory was the owner of the club. Oliver Harrison, arrogant, wealthy, and confident in his invincibility, was the last obstacle on my path to triumph. He thought he controlled everything and everyone, that his power was beyond question. He was used to the authority and influence that money grants people, but he didn't know that he had long since become my target. It all began when rumors of deaths and illnesses at the club started reaching the upper echelons. Oliver quickly realized something was wrong and began his own investigation. He thought he could find the culprits, that he could restore order, but he didn't know that order had long ceased to exist. I had created chaos, and now I was about to complete my masterpiece. I watched Oliver, observing how he became more and more immersed in the affairs of the club. He checked documents, met with people, asked questions. His persistence irritated me, but I knew that time was on my side. I knew his schedule, his habits, his weaknesses. He was too sure of himself, and that confidence would be his downfall. His face, always impeccably shaved and composed, began to show signs of fatigue. Wrinkles appeared on his forehead, and shadows of worry crept into his eyes. He couldn't understand what was happening. His world was falling apart, and he didn't know how to save it. But I did. I knew that soon his world would collapse completely. I began to prepare for the final move. Forging documents was not a difficult task. I had access to the club's archives. I knew what his accounts looked like, his business correspondence. I just needed to tweak the numbers a little, adjust the signatures slightly, and suddenly Oliver was entangled in a major corruption scandal. I gathered the documents, carefully checking each page. Every number, every signature had to look convincing. I knew the police would scrutinize them, that Oliver would try to defend himself, but I was prepared. My documents were indistinguishable from the originals. I sent them to the police, ensuring that the trail led back to Oliver. A few days later, I learned that the police had launched an investigation. Oliver was in a panic. He called lawyers, trying to figure out who could have set him up. He called meetings, met with club officials, but they were as frightened as he was. No one knew what was happening. No one understood that this was all part of my plan. I watched as he scrambled, as he tried to maintain his composure. He started to lose his cool, his voice growing louder when he spoke on the phone. I knew what he was feeling. fear, and helplessness. This was a survival game, and I knew I would come out the winner. "Who could have done this?" he shouted during a conversation with one of his lawyers that I happened to overhear. "Who dared to meddle in my affairs?" "Oliver, calm down," the lawyer replied, his voice sounding tired. "We'll find the culprit, but right now you need to be careful." "Careful?" Oliver laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Everything is falling apart, and you're telling me to be careful?" He didn't know that I was behind it all. He didn't know that I was a step ahead, and it was perfect. I watched his agony, watched his world crumble, and knew the end was near. Oliver decided to flee. He realized the police were too close, that the evidence was too strong. He knew he didn't have much time, that he needed to act fast, but I had already made my preparations. I knew he wouldn't get far. They arrested him at the airport as he tried to board a private jet. He screamed, resisted, claiming it was all a conspiracy. But no one listened to him. The police found the forged documents I had planted. His entire world collapsed in a matter of minutes. He thought he could escape, but I was a step ahead. I watched his arrest from the window of my house. I saw him being taken away in handcuffs, heard him shouting. His face, once full of confidence and arrogance, was now twisted with horror and despair. I looked at it and felt that I had won. Now the club was mine. I had won. It's funny how people create their own catastrophes. All it takes is a bit of manipulation and their world falls apart. I watched this, laughed, and knew that now I could do anything. I raised a glass of wine, watching as they drove him away. This was the culmination of my plan, and I savored every minute. Oliver thought he controlled everything, that he was above the law, but he didn't know that some things cannot be controlled. He didn't know that some people could control his life. Now it was all over. I was at the top and no one could stop me.